Are 6-day creationists guilty of believing in hyper-evolution? That's going to be our topic on today's episode. My name is Keaton Halley, and I'm here dialoguing remotely with Jonathan Sarfati. Welcome, Jono.
G'day, everyone.
All right, well, let's get into this challenge that has come up in a number of books written by critics of young Earth creationism. And I've heard people actually ask you the same question in public at different speaking events that we've been to, in Q&A times and so forth. They claim that we believe in evolution supposedly more strongly than evolutionists do. Why do people make this charge against us?
Well, they usually start by knocking. There's several different fallacies they use. One is equivocation, which is bait and switch. They define evolution as, say, change in allele frequency over time, but then they bait and switch and say it means particles to people, goo to you via the zoo. Now, creationists believe in change of allele frequency over time. I don't know anyone who doesn't believe that.
Right. Of course,
okay. So this is, but then they say, well, look at these evolution denied, but we're not denying allele change in allele frequency. We're denying the whole big picture, which is the real thing under dispute. So that's the first thing they do.
Yeah. But I think maybe what we want to get on the table first is, why they would accuse us of supposedly believing in super rapid evolution. It's basically because, well, a few things that we believe. Number one, at the time of the fall, we say, as Genesis 1:30 communicates, that all the creatures were herbivorous. They were plant eaters prior to the fall. And then after death entered the world, then animals began to eat one another. So they say that's an example of us believing in evolution. Or because we say that all the animals aboard the ark, Noah only took the land-dwelling, air-breathing vertebrates, basically. But he took a relatively few number of kinds of creatures, 2 of each kind of unclean animal, 7 or 14 of the clean animal kinds. But then those gave rise to all the diversity of land vertebrates that we have today. Mm-hmm. And they say, oh, look, there's like millions of species in the world. And so that's evolution after the flood that we say, the cats on the ark, for example, gave rise to lions and tigers and leopards and cheetahs and so on.
Well, there's a terrible dishonest bait and switch there because we think that the kinds on board the ark were the land vertebrate animals, not marine creatures, not insects, because they can all survive off the ark on vegetation rafts and pumice and driftwoods, as Darwin himself proved they could, by the way. So it's only land vertebrates, not marine. So therefore, the millions of species, most of them are insects or marine creatures. So these are things which lives on board the ark. So we're not saying that land vertebrates evolved into insects.
Yes.
So they're not comparing
or any of the sea creatures.
Right. So it's a complete bait and switch. So in fact, what we're doing is saying all the land vertebrates we observe today came from a relatively small number of ark animals, but the number is not exactly that huge. It's not thousands to millions. It's maybe thousands to thousands. And in fact, the founder of the Royal Society, Bishop Wilkins, who also founded the metric system, which America hasn't caught up with yet, he was the first to realize that. He's talking about in the 17th century, he realized that a few ark animals had the capacity to vary into different varieties. So this is before Darwin. So it's not an evolutionary concept. This is pre-Darwinian stuff. Pre-Darwinian creation. It's understood variation within the kinds, and they believe that was taught by the biblical account.
Yeah. So we're not new in what we're claiming here. And yeah, I agree with you. We see in some of the explicit writings on this, some of the people who make this argument are William Lane Craig, Dr. Hugh Ross of Reasons to Believe. In several of his books, he actually has a chapter in one of his books called Young Earth Darwinism, where he calls us hyper-evolutionists. And in several places, he's made this claim that we apparently believe trilobites were on the ark, for example. And then from those species, they gave rise to all the species, the millions of species allegedly that exist today.
Which means that Hugh Ross doesn't know what a trilobite is, which is a marine invertebrate creature. So he doesn't even know what it is. I don't think so. The problem is Craig parrots Hugh Ross, and Hugh Ross parrots a lot of atheistic evolutionary critics, like Ian Plimer, for instance.
I agree with you that I think this charge is just extremely misguided. It shows like a lack of understanding of one of the most basic points that we make in regard to this evolution controversy, that we need to distinguish between types of change. Like you mentioned allele frequency earlier, but I mean, there's all sorts of changes that we do agree with as creationists, like natural selection, mutations, even speciation is possible within our model, because we're not talking about natural processes that like write brand new genetic instructions that are, coding for complex specified machinery. We're just talking about the instructions that God, say, put into the cat kind to begin with. There was lots of potential for diversification if, a segment of the population lost certain genes or certain encoded information in their DNA as they migrated, to different parts of the world after Noah's flood. So the potential was there all along to have this diversification. It's not as though natural processes were building up their genomes over time. That's the distinction between the one type of change and another.
Well, I mean, nothing like this is going to create a new wing or new eyes or something totally new.
Yeah, exactly.
It's just sorting out information that already exists. And we often point this out in our talks about how if you have a genetically diverse pair, then they can have lots of varieties in one offspring. We talk about the different human two-tone twins when the parents are both biracial, as I think Adam and Eve would have been the equivalent to multiracial. God would have programmed lots of genetic diversity, heterozygosity, if you want the fancy term for it, and from that lots of varieties could happen quickly. So what do you need to do to keep them as separate varieties? You have to isolate them like we do with breeding of dogs, right? You want to breed dogs, you have a wild type, but then you want to select what you want and keep it from breeding with anything else. I mean, purebred owners are very finicky. They don't want that dog breeding with any old mutts.
Right.
If they care about the health, they would actually want them to breed because purebreds are unhealthy. But the thing is, so they want the unhealthy purebreds, they want to keep them separate from anything else. Okay.
Yeah. I sometimes say purebred is a good synonym for inbred.
Well, exactly what it is. You have inbreeding depression because you have a loss of the genetic diversity, but also concentration of mutations is the other issue for that. Yeah. But then think about the flood, where you got these small populations coming from the ark. They're small population. Probably God had selected the ones with the most heterozygosity, most genetic diversity. Then he got these small populations becoming automatically separated by the mountainous regions, are an automatic geographic barriers. So it's well known that mountains are good for creating new varieties and species quite quick. This is very well known. Even evolutionists understand this. Yeah.
So what you're saying here is that the flood itself, or the aftermath of the flood, as animals come off the ark and begin to spread around the world, this would just be an ideal situation for rapid speciation. And again, it's not. If the animals had a lot of potential to diversify to begin with, then that would be sort of it could be like a one-time change as well, because once all that diversity is sorted out and separated into different lineages, this is not necessarily going to continue to happen today. So I know like Hugh Ross in some of his writings say, oh, if this young earth view of hyper-Darwinism were true, we should see animals continuing to diversify today in the same way. Well, I think to some extent we do actually see evidence for rapid speciation today.
Does happen.
But if in kinds like, say, we know that in our view this would have had to have taken place pretty quickly, because in Scripture you've got, by the time of Abraham, you've already got camels, which would be related to llamas and alpacas and so forth, came from one pair of animals on board the ark. They've already diversified by Abraham's time. And maybe, camels aren't continuing to diversify dramatically today, but that's because of this. The way they diversified is not through Darwinian processes. It's by just taking the initial information and sorting it out into separate groups.
I mean, sheep and goats are the other thing. I mean, farmers like to keep sheep and goats separate because otherwise they will still interbreed to form geeps, right?
And that's another good point too. I think the fact that a lot of these species can actually hybridize with one another shows you what the original biblical kinds were, and shows you that there's not been eons of evolutionary time, separating them. They're still able, in many cases, to produce offspring.
Yeah, otherwise mutations would have made them genetically incompatible over the alleged millions of years, but it's only thousands of years or hundreds of years. we could never breed a wolf from a poodle or from a chihuahua, okay, but we certainly know that they came from wolf-like creatures. That's almost no one doubts that.
What's the problem supposed to be exactly? Is it that we're somehow going against Scripture? Does Scripture deny animals can change at all?
Well, I think no. Breeding is a well-established feature of Scripture, isn't it? Breeding has been well known, which is artificial selection. That's been known for a long time, long before Darwin. In fact, Darwin basically went to artificial selection and made an analogy to natural selection. So it's a concession that we already understood artificial selection to be a reality.
Yeah, the fixity of species view was held by some of Darwin's opponents in his day, but these were actually old Earth folks, not, biblical creationists who took Genesis at face value.
Well, when you think of Charles Lyell was the founder of uniformitarian geology, he was a lawyer more than a geologist, but he also was Darwin's mentor. He believed in fixity of species and centers of creation. So he believed that God created a species in this particular region, which later became extinct. And Darwin's origin of species was basically directed at Lyellian theories. So he would actually make his notebook, well, here's some points for me, here are points for Lyell. But biblical creationists are not vulnerable to his objections. Okay?
Yeah, because we don't believe in fixed centers of creation. We say that at least the land vertebrates that we have today migrated to the areas where we find them now from the Middle East, from leaving Noah's Ark.
When we think of the Galapagos, Darwin said, why are they similar but not quite the same as those on the South American mainland? It doesn't fit the Lyellian fixity of species and center of creation model, but it perfectly explains a migration path through South America to the Galapagos.
Yeah, exactly. So we would side with Darwin on that point, but that doesn't make us Darwinists.
Well, because Darwin was attacking an unbiblical model, and by the way, Hugh Ross basically holds fixity of species.
And that's the other point, too. On the one hand, this diversity that we believe in doesn't contradict the Bible, and it doesn't contradict science either. I think we're still learning to a large extent about exactly what mechanisms could cause, say, the cats on the ark to diversify into lions and tigers and cheetahs and so on. But, you could sort of see in principle, at least, there's nothing in science that we know now that would contradict that kind of a scenario. And it doesn't seem unreasonable, unlike the Darwinian view of change, which would say that microbes can turn into mankind over millions of years. Maybe a good analogy for this, Jono, that I thought about ahead of time would be a ball that has the potential to fall down the stairs. We point out that if God designed the world, the laws of physics in such a way that that's possible, a ball can fall down the stairs quite rapidly. But imagine there are people that are claiming the ball can fall all the way up a whole flight of stairs as long as the changes are slow and gradual, one little step at a time. And then we get accused of being believing in more stair movement. Than those. Well, yeah, we think it can fall down the stairs quick.
Yeah.
Just because we see those types of changes doesn't mean we believe that it can go all the way up the stairs by natural processes alone.
And that sort of leads to the issue that there are many more ways of breaking something than making something. You can break something quite quickly. There's so many different ways of doing it, but to try to make that structure, a lot of different ways a creature could become blind, and maybe in a dark cave that would be selected for, well, at least not selected against, because there's no vision for anyone anyway, but trying to explain the origin of sight is quite a different matter.
Exactly. Or I think of another observation Darwin made was about the insects on windy islands that he noticed don't have wings. Like the whole population is wingless, but he noticed they were very similar to other beetles on the mainland that did have wings.
Yep.
And again, I think he was right to say that the wingless versions came from insects on the mainland that flew there and then somehow lost those wings. So yeah, we believe in lots of processes that you can break wings. That's easy and even rapid.
And advantageous, that's what I think Darwin was saying, as we would say, because they can't fly up and get blown into the sea. So it might be advantageous not to have a wing, but it's still downhill. It's still breaking something. I mean, the ark could actually fit, even if all the land vertebrate genera were on the ark, if you needed to, which means it's even less of a problem with this so-called hyper-evolution if you start with genera.
Do you have a good idea of what the numbers might actually be? Like how many kinds on the ark, and it gave rise to how many species living today? They say it's millions, but that is likely an exaggeration,
That's
right,
it.
as
Again,
far as the land vertebrates go.
No, it's definitely not millions of land vertebrates. I think it's sort of in the tens of thousands at the most. I mean, look at the classic book Genesis Flood, right, which is older than you and I are. I think that actually, they show they could actually put every species. You don't think you need to do it, but you could actually do it.
Yeah.
So they calculated the number of mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, and Morris said you could put them on, but I think you don't need to do that.
Yeah. And if it's at the family level, roughly speaking, the biblical kind corresponds roughly to a family, then it would just be like 2,000 animals on board the ark is all.
That's all.
And could those give rise to, 10,000 or a couple tens of thousands of species today? I think that's not at all implausible.
Well, given we're talking about highly genetically diverse ark kinds and the rapid allopatric speciation from the mountainous regions.
Yeah,
it's very well known. Yeah.
So crunching the numbers themselves, even it's a perfectly plausible scenario that we're proposing. So, all right, well, I think that pretty much takes care of the issue. But of course, we've written a lot, like Refuting Compromise, and people can go to creation.com. We'll post some links in the show notes below to other articles. If you enjoyed this video, do give us a thumbs up and subscribe so you can get future content from us. And feel free to comment as well in the comments section below, and we'll interact with you there. So thank you for watching, and hope to see you again next time.